Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to speak with everyday superheroes helping nonprofits using technology. Joining me today is Ben Johnson to talk about frontier and marketing. Ben, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so excited.
So, for people who are hearing you for the first time, could you share your superhero origin story, please? How did you get
Yeah.
started working with nonprofits? And what is a bit of your background?
Yeah, I'd sort of say there's a few parts to it. One is I took a entrepreneurial management degree at Royal Roads University in Victoria, and kind of as I was finishing, a few people tagged me. I was saying like I had a great love and skill for marketing. I started working at the university, and part of the reason was I wanted it to be purpose driven in the direction that I did marketing. So if you're going to be persuasive, I didn't want to be tricking people just for making a buck and selling sugar water, as I said. And then I stumbled upon in my journey Union Gospel Mission in Vancouver. I worked there for about a year doing online fundraising, which at the time was this sort of new space where like a 22-year-old could do whatever they wanted. It was like 2009. And I moved with my family back to Victoria, which ended up being, this was before COVID, well before. So if you move out of the city that you work in, that means that's over. And so I sort of went to my now client, former boss, and said, like, I'm moving. How about I take this with me and become a contractor? So that was essentially the journey of being cause oriented very quickly, a few years of just making sure I was sort of convincing people to be more generous.
Cool. So then you started this company called Frontier Marketing. What was the decision making? What was the reason behind Frontier Marketing?
There's sort of when I started to do the contracting, I thought of for a few months of like what I would call it, what invoices I would send to my former boss. And many years ago, my grandpa started a company, Frontier Engineering, and it so happens that I'm a huge Star Trek fan. One of the things I loved about the idea of digital innovation, or more broadly, just improving on and finding the next thing, was the frontier. And there was something kind of I enjoyed about like the Wild West nature of frontier, like that's very entrepreneurial in itself. So it allowed for both a nerdy stars exploration, but also like that Wild West culture. And it was a sort of a callback to my grandpa's company. Originally, we called it Frontier Consulting because it was just me doing consulting. And I think it was about 4 years in, there was about 10 of us, and we were about to get a new space. And it was just this deciding of like, let's go and get a really big space, move on from our old cocoon and shell of being Frontier Consulting, and embrace that we're now Frontier Marketing. And that's because we had over time become a group of people that were a full-scale marketing agency that I had hired a writer and a designer, and we had a programmer, and we were building data modeling tools. Like it was more than just Ben consulting to his former employer. So part of the embrace of the name Frontier Marketing was to say this is a recognition of who we are. It wasn't sort of forward looking, if that makes sense.
It does, and I love the name because I'm also a Trekkie, and there aren't too many Trekkies out there. Or at least I haven't met as many as I should have. So I love the
Yeah.
analogy, and there's a lot of wordplay and analogy and creative ideas you can come up with a name like Frontier.
Yeah, I love it. And then, I think we're a few years in, and I made a compass for us, sort of kind of that arrow pointing in the direction, so to think. And at the end of the day, our strategists, and so if we're doing marketing for charities, we're fundraising money, but we're doing it through the lens of marketing. Like our idea is to be guides and partners. And so kind of the internal culture is thinking of it as like that orienteering guide, like it's a known thing, but it's still a journey.
Interesting, because my logo on Dryad Consulting is also a kind of a compass as well, tilted a bit and a bit angled, but it's the same concept with a guide, exactly that, a guide.
I love it. And like, I think that's something important in the nonprofit world is maybe the old culture is we know all, we'll tell you, give us all your money. That's like kind of the old world of agencies is like, you don't know better, just like rely on us. And I think the more modern is to come alongside that there is important skills within a nonprofit that should be, and just like if we were to think of it like a business, is like what are the core competencies of this business and what is it trying to be known for? And I think it's okay now for a nonprofit to go, hey, you know what, like we're not going to be great at everything, or we're not going to make transitions. For instance, on your end, like the idea of like being in-house experts in implementation and on Salesforce is only useful for certain people, because it's like there's a point in times where that knowledge is really needed. And instead of being like, ah ha ha, now you need me, bow down to the supplier kind of thing, like, which honestly feels like that was the old world. It's the better organizations are the one that come alongside, and I think there's like it's easier for nonprofits to, and like ironically, rely on organizations that aren't so kind of heavy-handed. You know what I mean?
It's about partnerships, like you said,
Mhm.
guiding not even by leading, but more guiding like side by side, hand in hand kind of guiding, at least the way that I would visualize it. So yeah, I agree on that kind of visual. I'm curious to know on LinkedIn, you've been obviously with the organization for quite a long time now, and your title has changed throughout the years. It started from founder to executive director to lead strategist to champion of growth. So what happened along the way? Why do you have so many titles?
Yeah, this one gave me when I was thinking about how I'd respond, gave me some giggles, and I think our team will find it funny. One is like, as an entrepreneur, like throughput, it's hard for me to be consistent, and like a challenge I have is like, what do I say I am? Because I started doing this when I was 23 years old, and so here I am at 36, and more or less in the same shell of a company known as Frontier, but it's got 30 people instead of just me, and it's in its 13th year. So part of that is me recognizing different eras where I had different roles. And so at the beginning, like what you call yourself when there's 1 to 5 people, I kind of wanted to say that era was the era of being just the founder of Frontier. And then we had an era where we grew from 6 people to 12. And it was quite intentional to be at 12, and be an organization that had about a dozen clients and a little over $1 million a year in revenue, and quite happy with the lifestyle business that was Frontier. And then we embarked on an era of quite a bit of growth. Like I said, we're 30 people now, and made a shift so that we would build a management team. So I'm no longer the executive director, no longer the number one, and I kind of returned to my primary function that was back in the day, which was being the strategist, or maybe a more traditional term would be like account director. So the kind of the overseer of our largest clients, but also kind of where is the puck going from a fundraising perspective, being the lead strategist. And that was just sort of like, if you kind of think of through the entrepreneurship lens, is someone who's like, I love kayaking. And then you start a kayaking business. And then you are the owner of a group of kayak guides, and the last thing you do is touch the water. So one of the things that third era allowed is like, you know what, guys, I'm quite a good kayak guide. What if I had a portfolio of clients, and some other group of people was responsible for the kind of the managing of the organization from a people and culture standpoint, and kind of the key decisions. And then there's some changes for the organization more recently, and we were kind of workshopping different names and titles. And one that was sort of thrown was Chief Growth Officer or Chief of Growth. And I was like, you know what? I want to be weird. I love this phase of my life. I want to be a champion of growth. And folks were like, what does that mean? I was like, exactly. And part of it is my role now engages a lot externally, particularly with partners, and sort of there's kind of partnerships, biz dev, finding new clients, like from a sales and marketing perspective, but also just that internal champion of wanting to make sure that everyone is very growth oriented, and that's sort of me finding my deeper calling with that final title.
I think it's also a kind of a return to not innocence, but at least keeping your childhood alive. And I like having those kind of references as well. Like part of the reason why I have got the company Dryad Consulting is that it's a nod to my childhood when I used to play Dungeons and Dragons. And as we're talking, I'm looking at you here, and you got a little icon of yourself of a dragon, which is really cool too. So it's really nice to have that kind of playful touch to what you do, because I think loving what you do makes life so much easier. And they say if you love what you do, you don't work a day in your life. So it sounds like you're in the same kind of spirit as that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I have a few quotes at home, and one of them is C.S. Lewis. So, like, someday you'll be old enough to start reading fairy tales again. And I think
Nice.
you captured that perfectly. Where when I did my sort of final send off, I had a few quotes from Alice in the Wonderland, and one of them is like, "Who in the world am I? Ah, that's the great puzzle." And that's sort of the directionality where I'd want my career to go, and in terms of is just sort of embracing the mystery. And you find a lot of that in marketing and fundraising, and a lot of our clients are faith-based. So I think sometimes I remind them that some of what they believe is a mystery. And then Alice said another thing, which was, it's no use going back to yesterday because I was a different person then. Just that whole idea of like thinking of six impossible things before breakfast, like that is my brain. And I think, like you said, like kind of that childhood innocence was, I think I was often chastised for having that type of brain, where it is totally conceptual, can bounce around, very, and the positives being innovation and strategy and those sort of things. But it's like, oh, hey, can you be more of a linear processor? And that to some degree is just sort of trying to contain the magic, right?
Absolutely. You need to let that free spirit out, basically. So I'm curious then, changing topics slightly, what kind of services does Frontier offer?
Yeah, and like there's a few of us, particularly in Canada, so that's kind of the limited domain of our frontier. Although I'll kind of get back to how that's changing a little bit. So originally we were just digital folks. We would send email on behalf of clients, build their websites, landing page. We even built a custom checkout system that we offer as a product. So we were often that sort of digital agency for organizations that had a print agency, because often those print fundraising agencies were kind of the boomer built organization that tried to bolt on digital. And so over time, we actually did the opposite, which was we often felt that print was this strange Wizard of Oz that we didn't understand until maybe 2015. We started to take it on more fully. So we're full service now. Actually, I think we're probably one of the largest print fundraising organization in Canada now. But so if you ever want a newsletter and a direct mail appeal along with tons of email, like that sort of annual plan from an agency doing all that heavy lifting. I think something that's a little bit unique to us is literally everything is done by our teams. So we have the data specialists for segmentation and whatnot, but also we build the emails as well. And then a particular specialty is around both digital and print acquisition.
That's actually quite a spectrum you got there. So the full digital agency, when you said direct mail, you said direct mail or direct email or both?
Yeah, there was like we started with just being the digital only agency, and then when we tackled print, we're like, you know what, we're direct response, and the term that we championed for a while, and among others, was integrated marketing. That it's important to communicate to these, the same humans that were getting email and mail. There was, obviously differences to begin with when something's new, but the idea of a more holistic approach to the donor was something that we were championing, and that the more integrated things look, or the more cohesive, I guess, the more trustworthy the organization is, and ultimately the better results you'll have. And I think it moved an organization as a way. This is one issue that a lot of nonprofits have, is that because there's silos and structure within the organization, they try and silo and structure the donor. Like, oh, Alex is a major giving donor versus a donor to the organization who probably has a phone and answers his email and has a physical property of which he could receive mail. And so a big thing that we were championing is just to kind of break down those silos and say it's integrated direct response.
You're one of the first organizations that I heard that started or focused, let's say, on digital email and then moved to direct mail. How do you find the response rate? Is it, obviously the shift is moving away from print and more to email, but maybe you've noticed a different trend. Like, can you speak a bit about the success rate of direct mail?
Yeah, no, it's funny. It's like in some ways we started selling water or bubbly, and then we decided to add Coca-Cola. You know what I mean? Like, and one of the reasons I'm describing that is we took the emergent thing at the time, which was email, and then we worked our way back to the thing that was mature. And so the early 2010s, people were like, direct mail is dead. A lot of our clients have had a significant amount of growth in print over every one of those years that print was supposed to be dead. And even now, like we're doing reviews of our kind of a final to the year and getting ready for 2023 and hoping that we can have response rate growth among our clients. Acquisition, the one thing about acquisition is it's easier to have that direct link in print to get into homes. And one thing that organizations need to be aware of is sort of the quote unquote younger audience is Gen X, not millennials. Like, millennials will become first time donors, but it's important to remember that those who are arriving in their 50s right now are kind of the Gen X generation, but will always have a physical presence. And I think doing print well is important, and that there's an opportunity to give someone a tactile experience of what is an invisible thing, right? Like at the end of the day, what really gets me excited about fundraising, and it's weird, is that someone parts with their money, they get nothing back, and they feel good about it. And so one of the things you can do with print is provide some of a tactile nature of that they are getting something back, whether it's a postcard or photos and a story that is explaining to them the outcome of what they just did.
That's really cool. So, who would be your ideal client then? You kind of hinted that you're mostly Canada focused, but then maybe shifting elsewhere. Maybe what size of client do you normally work with, or sector?
Yeah, there's and it's always tough to find that niche, and so most of our clients um, are, I'd say, within the $500,000 raised to $10 million raised. So we don't have any organizations that are raising 50 to 100 million, and sort of those well-known orange or blue, the big famous ones in Canada, being sort of that national, if not international organizations. Our client group is made up of, I'd say, three subsets. One is poverty relief. So, that Union Gospel Mission Vancouver being our first ever client who's still a client. Turns out there's one in every town, so to speak. We worked our way into international development organizations. Most of those are raising around 2.5 million a year as an annual giving perspective. And then our kind of third emergent has been health organizations. What I really think is interesting is I think it's because there's so many traditional agencies that work with, big hospital foundation in the city, is a lot of our health organizations tend to be either around youth, children, or mental health or women's health. So I think where we tend to be a leader is kind of in that other segment that isn't just talking about health, it's health around a particular issue. So yeah.
And similar to those three areas, I noticed also on your LinkedIn, you have this thing called what you call the Venn diagram, not the Venn diagram,
Yeah.
where you mentioned you focus on or you talk about marketing, measurement, and management. And I'm curious to know, like obviously the sweet spot usually is in the intersection of all three. What to you is in that small intersection?
Yeah, and part of it was through a few people I received through through their content, not actually knowing them, advice of working on strengths versus working on weaknesses. And then like no one's going to solve a debate. It's more of like a philosophical schools of thought. And I really love the idea of mixing multiple strengths. Scott Adams talks about this. It's like he could draw cartoons and he had an MBA, but when he merged the two, he became the guy who wrote Dilbert cartoons. And so one of the things I was looking into with myself is like, what would be a few things I'd want to continually hone? I at the 2010 is when I kind of created this. I loved data visualization. I had finished getting an accounting designation, and it wasn't necessarily the numbers that got me. It was that idea of data informing or data direction. And so particularly we wanted to be a data-driven organization. And I didn't want to be the foremost expert in it, but just in terms of learning about different ways to present data, how to be skilled as a presenter and showing people and engaging with them around data. And then there's the accountant in me that, from a measurement standpoint, but it's also being very, not Spock like, but just that idea of like, how do we, and from a business standpoint, have a very measured approach to things as a line I'd use a lot. And I had an entrepreneurial management degree and love different management theories and strategies and tactics. I think all those three combined are how I perform as a strategist. And I think it's also helpful for like when doing Pro D. So I'm certified with Berkman, which is sort of a leadership styles assessment tool. And so that was one of the ways of like, oh, how do I level up the management side? Because I've got my accounting designation and been diving into kind of the data world so much.
So it sounds like you draw upon all these are three of your strengths, for example, and you are in the middle. You are the combination of the marketing side, the measurement side, and the management side. Or you as in the organization.
Yeah, definitely me, the person. It was sort of like it's like anyone as an individual, like, oh, what do I want to be great at? I'd suggest avoiding, creating one thing because then, like, if you can have, say, my colleague Kirk Schmidt, who's been on the podcast, he's very well spoken. He, I would say a lot of times he behaves as an extrovert, and he's a great communicator. If he was just a mathematician, we might be missing out on following him on LinkedIn and having him be such a great communicator. And so just like that ability that he has where he's combined forces of two great skills. And I think it's just way more useful than looking at your weaknesses and cutting those out. Those weaknesses are just idiosyncrasies of who you are, in my opinion.
And I think people expect, or not expect, but appreciate a more genuine person these days. Faults and all, whatever colorful nature you want to be or playful nature you want to be. I think that's what counts more than anything than ever before, let's say.
Yeah, and then you never come across someone who doesn't have weaknesses, right? And like you said, they're almost become personality characteristics, but how high your strengths are often determine your overall success.
I totally agree. So I'm curious to change topics slightly and relate the conversation a bit more to tech. And I'm curious to know, in order to do all of these great things, digital agency, print agency, newsletters, direct mail, email, what kind of tech do you guys use at Frontier to do all this stuff?
Yeah, and most of the underlying technology that we've kind of used to get work done hasn't changed in many, many years. It might be to our detriment. Although one emergent tool that I think we could use 10x more is Loom. And I think we're in that era of, we're doing a Zoom call right now, but how do we have that just-in-time communication internally? And I think our default has been Slack, which is to our detriment. Text-based messaging is not how society should function. That's it's obvious, but it's absurdly common among teams like ours is to communicate through short snippets. Getting better at using things like Loom, where it can be like this guided tour. Hey, I'm walking you through this file. Here are my 3 issues, and then you send that file.
You know that Slack now has the possibility of doing huddles, right? Which can do.
Yes, huddles are great, but huddles are that small replacement for us being in person of like, hey, Alex, can I chat with you for a couple minutes about something? And the thing I love about it is if you do it within, so like say the channel structure versus like the kind of the DM of like just one-on-one, there's that opportunity for other people to walk in. But that requires real time. That's like one of those differences of what if I have a colleague who's in a different continent right now and it's just too inconvenient for us all to gather at the same time. And particularly my calendar, I block out so that there almost never is any available time. So we need to have that asynchronous communication. Otherwise, like Dropbox is a huge tool for us and kind of the Google Suite. We're really starting to dive in more and more to Google Data Studio. But yeah, it's just like the cloud products of the 2010s sustain this company. That's for sure.
So what does Loom offer that Slack doesn't? Maybe I'm not so familiar with Loom as you are.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so I particularly also think in terms of how it overlaps with sort of standard operating procedures. So it'd be like if you wanted to train someone on how to host this podcast, you could do it in the form of a Loom that it is like a recorded Zoom video, but it puts your camera image into the bottom left corner in a little circle, and it's in so you can construct a video for someone where you're like, oh, like this is a guided tour, right? Like a screen recording of how to do X. So it could also be like I'm reviewing this file and I had these 10 issues. So take a look here, and this you could do it in a few minutes. One of our strategists has started to send looms to clients. So it's again, you could just do a screen recording of sorts with Zoom, but it's just so custom built for that kind of the guided tour experience. But also just internally, we now all have Loom accounts, so there's saved files, and it was built for archiving, I guess.
Okay, that makes more sense then. So it's more of like you said, a screen sharing guided type of approach, but you're still able to see the person speaking, so there's that interaction that remains.
Mm-hmm,
Okay.
mm-hmm.
And then so you Dropbox, G Suite, obviously these are the common ones. I was also curious then on the nonprofit side, when you're working with various nonprofits, do you see any common technologies or do you recommend certain technologies that they use to interact with them? I mean, you mentioned Loom, that you're now sending these Loom videos to them. Is there anything else that you would like them to use or prefer them using just to make your life easier?
Yeah, well, I'll kind of start with a couple conceptual things. One is tech debt, and the other one is tech stack. When the pandemic began, a lot of nonprofits found out that they had a lot of tech debt, which is they made decisions in the past that are now haunting them in the present. And so for one, if you had a, server and it was on your physical location, and then you tell everyone to work from home, and then they don't know how to access XYZ, like, oh, the all our files are at the office. If only there was a software in the cloud that we could access all our files, or just there's all sorts of things that we know about in the nonprofit world where a decision was made maybe in scarcity, or it was in a time where we didn't think of tech as being central to our functioning. It's like hard to believe that like the 2010s technology was sort of a nice to have. And so for one is I think a deeper investment in tech. And that is an understanding now that it's a tech stack. And so those of us that have been in the nonprofit world for the last 20 years, you could make a decision on what email marketing tool you'd have, like MailChimp. But then if you switch from Razor's Edge product to Salesforce, then you'd hear about something like Pardot. And on and on and on, you could make different tech decisions. But then in the past, it was like, do what you want, make a decision about your area if it was within that siloed structure. And now we realize that they're so interconnected that I can't talk about a donation system without talking about everything else. And so I think number one is I'd want organizations to embrace those two principles of like, what is our tech debt? Like, where do we pay now in time instead of technology? Because we might have been short sighted, just like everyone else. And then how do we make decisions around the whole instead of kind of that old thinking that they weren't so interconnected? Because like one thing is I as an advisor, as a coach, consultant, whatever, I can't really say, hey, you should go with this CRM or this email marketing tool without the context of everything else. Like that's there's sort of the proverb, like good, bad, who can say? And of course, the more forward thinking they are, and how do they embrace the cloud and that sort of thing. But like just so much of the context is now, well, what do you have? So you can only make a few decisions a year, kind of thing. Like you can, it's very much the bold era of big changes seems to be over.
I remember seeing it was a Dilbert kind of styled cartoon that was passed around LinkedIn a few years ago that asked the question, what was the biggest driver of your tech stack today? And the choices were like CEO, CTO, and the third one, which was one that was everyone chose in this comic, was COVID. That it really drove
Mm-hmm.
everything. The whole, like you said, getting people into the cloud remotely, securely, of course, and deciding on a tech stack was like the number one thing that, well, at least on our side, a lot of things that we've seen people do is that they had to adapt and they had to modernize. And it's tough sometimes, especially for people like myself that's in the tech stack so much that you lose track that certain organizations are still X years behind that are still working on older systems and are now being forced through that transition.
Yeah, no, very well said.
And I think you're right in the sense of you're building and you're helping them with nonprofits with ecosystems. It's not just here is one system by itself in a silo. You have to keep aware of what are the other systems that it connects to, how it all works together at an ecosystem level, right? You don't just switch between Android and iPhone without a huge uplift. So you usually tend to stick with one or the other, right? You have a Google phone, you tend to buy more Google products, and you have an Apple phone, you tend to buy more Apple products because they work better together. So having that kind of holistic perspective, I think, is an important part of a tech stack.
Truly, and what you don't want is like that outside source that says like, well, I prefer this, so now change everything else. you want to be like, oh, this is the situation, so now therefore this is the next logical step. And I think it's important for organizations to have that vision for their tech stack, because like the traditional one says like we'd love to have one tool that does everything. And I'd be like, would you ever want an employee that says, no, let me do everything? And now you're beholden to them, right? And so, like, do you want one that is the employee of the year, which is the kind of the tech that plays well with others? And I think we've all seen that with, especially in the nonprofit space, there's a company that's well known for not playing well with others and trying to be an all-in-one. And then it means a lot of nonprofits are beholden to that organization instead of the tool serving them.
But to go then back to the services you offer, is it more of a managed services? Like if a nonprofit comes to you, you just take over their marketing side of things, or do you have situations where you will advise them, coach them on a particular way of doing things, and then send them on the way, like teaching a man to fish expression kind of style?
Yeah, our doorway in is often we have two products and they kind of work in tandem. One, and so that kind of a consulting plan or a fundraising plan is what they are, but one's a capacity for growth plan. And so this would be a 1 to 3 year plan to say, given our time together and where you're at, this is where we would suggest you investing more. There's a dozen ways to grow your fundraising, and no organization is good at all of them, nor should you improve all of them at the same time. So part of the coming alongside for 90 to 100 days is to build a plan that is feasible and viable, to say, like, we know you, we see where you're at, check in with them throughout the whole process. Do you have X? Do you have Y? So that, we've all been there with a consultant who gives a presentation at the end in front of, like, maybe you brought your board and they're like, oh my goodness, like, why didn't you bring this up? Like, you're suggesting stuff that we have. Or we just did that and it didn't work, and now they're very frustrated. So our capacity for growth plans are trying to create a fundraising plan that says we grab all their data and produce KPIs, and again, that's us being that very data driven people, and saying this is what we think is your ability to grow over the next few years. And I think that's something that's more of a personal passion, is like, how do you have that kind of measured approach to optimism? Right? Like, hey, we think you can grow 15% per year for 3 years, so long as you're investing $10,000 in acquisition. And we know that $10,000 is reasonable for you, and we're not giving you a number that we just spit out, kind of thing. And our other one is we call messaging for growth, which branding is a funny one in the charity space, because the moment you say branding, oh, hey, we just paid for one. Like, look at our logo. Why would you want to change your name? And it's actually more around pricing that is important. Particularly in Canada, there's another thing too, which is, the HIPPO, the highest paid person's opinion. When we do messaging for growth, we do a couple key things. One is we both ask internal questions, but also calling donors and getting that qualitative review from them of, like, why are you giving? And particularly, we focus it around different pricing amounts. Because that's one of the opportunities and challenges that nonprofits have, is that I wear a Timex watch, and let's say it's worth about $75. They can't release a $7,500 version as much as they would want to. And similarly, it'd be ridiculous for Rolex to roll out the $80 affordable version, because that's not in keeping with their brand. And so one of the things we say is often a nonprofit grows around a certain price point, or being known for being very valuable at a certain giving amount. So if I'm a huge hospital foundation, like in Toronto, like Sick Kids, maybe like that larger amount is where their strengths have been. But what do donors who give 200 or 500 find valuable about them? Because it's really interesting that I could give 30, 300, 3,000, 30,000 to the same organization, whereas that's not something that is principally found in commerce. So we interview people at those levels and try and help the organization better frame who they are to those people, both in terms of what they say about themselves, like, $300 does X for Y, and realize that they essentially are multiple brands, even though they might have the same name.
So capacity for growth, messaging for growth. I like HIPPO, by the way. It's been a while since I've heard that one.
But you've experienced it constantly, though, right?
Of course. So these are short term or short. I mean, they're 1 to 3 year program. You did mention
Yep.
the second one. How long is that one for? Just to give me a number.
Yeah, like so similarly, so like we usually come alongside for like 90 days with an organization. Both of them we could probably do in 3 weeks, but it's that idea of like a nonprofit is almost never blessed with tons of capacity, hence the capacity for growth. And so that idea of meeting in a like sort of breathing fashion of we go away, come back, ask another question, get a little bit more details. Few organizations are in such a rush that they need to be doing things within a 1 month sprint. So it's sort of kind of coming alongside for a few months and then kind of here's a report, here's your plan. I hope you love it. A lot of organizations tend to use us for the portion that is the direct response within it, but that's the plans aren't contained to that.
So tying it back then to the technology, in these kinds of events or engagements, do you normally come on board and just use what they currently have and augment it, or do you recommend certain new tools and applications to carry them to the next level?
I don't know if it's a sort of a industry transformation or a frontier change or what, but I'd say 10 years ago, we had our preferred tools. We even made our own checkout for online giving. And it was basically, it's our way or the highway. We were also extraordinarily low cost. Like if you want us to do email, we're going to use MailChimp. Because there's that like we know it well and you don't pay us to know other things until we realized, well, what if the client said, I'm okay with paying you to know other things? And so we went from being very particular about the tools that we'd use to being more aware that clients have made different choices. And as much as I don't ever want to use constant contact, if I come across an organization that has it, we're still willing to work with them, kind of thing. It's like, okay, let's acknowledge that you have that. And then the diversity around CRMs has changed, and so like we've learned to adapt our process around data just to say like where are you at, what do you have. An area of improvement for us in our onboarding is like getting those questions out right away, just because part of our history is just, built around those old preferences. So I think like a good agency realizes that I kind of have a line of just like how we want you to treat your donors, we're going to meet you where you're at. So our team has become very sort of tech literate in quite a few different tools and systems, just to be more amenable to wherever that organization is at.
I share your lack of love for constant contact. It's not the most ideal application, but I do appreciate the fact that you will adapt to obviously your client's needs. It's hard to be good at everything, though, isn't it? It's there's so many tech choices out there these days that it's hard to. It's great when you can direct them or guide them toward one particular one that you're more familiar with and that it works really, really well. It's hard to be good at every single marketing email application.
Yeah, and it's like it used to be that I would hear a different name for a database every month. And like, oh, we're using at ease, and I'd be like, what? What is that? And this it would go like here and there. And email marketing tools tend to be a little bit more constant. One thing I've enjoyed about the rise of tech companies dedicated to charities like Fundraise Up, is that kind of I mentioned it earlier in the podcast. Is Frontiers sort of become these Canadian border guards, I like to call it, where there's all sorts of US companies that are virtuous trying to make their way into Canada. And there's often a perception of like, oh, we've done our homework. And our organizations have positioned ourselves to be like, oh, let's just check. Have you done this? Have you done that? Oh yeah. We've consulted a CRA lawyer. It's like, okay, well, or like, have you translated effectively into French? And they're like, oh, of course, it's a second language. You know how Americans treat second languages. And we were like, oh, actually, no, this one is a co-equal. So just in terms of like raising the bar of standards of tech within the charity sphere in Canada, that's something I've really like personally love, is like when we partner with tech companies, is to making sure that they are truly serving Canadian audience well.
Awesome. I also noticed you have a podcast. What do you do on the podcast? What can people listen to? What can they learn when listening to your podcast?
Yeah, there's two parts to it. My colleague Becca and I are running it together right now. It was originally started with my kind of colleague Matt, and sometimes Megan will join us. So kind of the strategist shooting the breeze internally. And then the kind of the second part is I've enjoyed interviewing people much the same way that you are. But the original premise where it is like Becca and I, for instance, is kind of recognizing that in the charity world, you're often kind of left to your lonesome, and there isn't really work focused banter discussion around trends. How does text messaging apply? Like, does it? And without it being very it's like this. It's not like it's a conversation instead of a sales pitch. Like to hear people wrestle over different concepts, go, oh, that's like this is where we're at right now with this, and I love to talk about emerging things, particularly in commerce first. And at the end of the day, it was like that early days of COVID inspired someone on our team said we should do a podcast. And so I took Seth Godin's workshop around podcasting. And it was like one of those few spaces where you could have art in our world. And no one would know it better than yourself, where you can engage with it just cause. So at the end of the day, Frontier FM is just cause.
It's really enjoyable having a podcast. I mean, it allows people to multitask as well. I think a lot of people, especially myself at least, able to clean the dishes or mow the lawn or do something else, drive to work when I used to drive to work and listen to a podcast, right? And it's
Yeah.
a great way to keep your mind active without listening to just random radio and advertisements.
Yeah, and you're like and there's this interesting way of like feeling connected, even if you're not fully listening to the substance. It's like being that fly on the wall, right? And like hearing a conversation like this and feeling that you're a part of it. And yeah, there's this network of podcasts too where that I've enjoyed, like this being a part of, that otherwise wouldn't happen. Like it's a new medium of connection.
It is. So what does the future of Frontier look like? What is your next title, for example, if you were to choose, or do you already know what your next title might be?
No, that's I feel like we're a year out for that. I'm likely to get more involved in partnerships and kind of helping kind of the big rocks of for Frontier for overall growth. So hence, it's the champion of growth allows to be in there. And we've got a few tools and products that we need to expand greatly over the next couple of years. But it's an interesting. I would say one thing is that it's an interesting era for agencies, is that a lot of medium or large organizations as nonprofits are deciding to take things, as they would say, in-house. And that's like thinking that they could have their own internal kind of agency for just themselves, and that would be more beneficial than hiring an organization like Frontier. I'm genuinely curious about whether that's effective or not. I think they're relying on a bias that being in the organization has a greater output than being beside it. I foresee Frontier growing quite a bit over the next few years because of our effort to systematize what we do even better, so that it's easier for other great strategists to join and serve quite a few charities. And that's sort of our model, is that a strategist serves 3 to 4 organizations. And there's this huge benefit in doing that, in that, so like someone on our team is working for Pacific Wild and helping a wilderness organization, but also working with an international development organization, while also working with a women's health foundation. And there's the like that neuroplasticity, and that like you're learning the deeper strategic values by doing all three. And then when you have a whole bunch of colleagues who are all doing the same thing, we have these shared learnings, which is the foundation of why corporations exist, right? Like it's when you can share knowledge internally, it increases your value. And Frontier hasn't always been at that point of understanding its strength. So my thing is like, let's command the space that we occupy. And so I think that actually means sort of pretty great big growth for us.
Well, that's awesome. I really hope you guys continue to grow from 30 to 100.
Oh, thank you. And it's like, at the end of the day, if anyone's in a nonprofit or consultancy, is like, I think at the end of the day, what's made us successful is honoring our culture, and that they're having a place to work within that charity sphere that's somewhat unique, and that has building your tribe. And like we have a Sabbath week, for instance, where everyone in the whole company gets the week off. And we've been doing this for most of a decade, well before the Nikes of the world had a mental health week. And it really is like kind of going back to earlier, is like re-embracing your childhood or embracing your weird,
Awesome. Listen, this has been great, Ben. Where can people find more about you online?
Yeah, and I think both of us love LinkedIn. So LinkedIn is my primary means of communication, and I'm now trying to look up how to like my name's Benjamin Johnson on LinkedIn, but it's uh, I go by Mr. Ben Johnson for the URL, so we could probably have it show notes, whatnot. But looking for Benjamin Johnson, and otherwise email ben@frontier.io.
Awesome. We'll also add the link to your podcast and to your website. So thank you so much for joining me today, Ben.
Oh, thank you so much, Alex.
All right, then, that's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me in the next Agents of Nonprofit.